They announced my departure with the excitement of a product launch, not the exit of the only person who understood the company's technological nervous system. The CEO, standing beneath screens displaying rising stock charts, spoke about evolution, fresh perspectives, and the necessity of moving away from legacy thinking. It amused me how easily they forgot the late nights spent preventing catastrophic data breaches and the weekends sacrificed to stop servers from melting under unforeseen user surges. I watched colleagues clap with misplaced enthusiasm, oblivious to the fact that every milestone they celebrated existed because of invisible decisions I had made in silence. No one paused to ask why nothing had ever collapsed under my watch. My replacement entered my office before the applause died. He barely glanced at me as he dropped his backpack onto my chair, already assuming ownership of a role he knew only in theory. He bragged about his certifications, his automation expertise, and his belief that experience was overrated. He dismissed my scripts as outdated, confidently labeling them bloated artifacts of a bygone era. He didn't notice that those artifacts were not decorative code but barricades, patches, and hidden algorithms that neutralized threats before alarms sounded. To him, systems were diagrams, not ecosystems that required intuition born from failure and repetition. The board applauded loudly that day, intoxicated by the promise of youth and speed. They congratulated themselves on being visionary leaders who dared to eliminate what they believed was redundancy. Yet in their eagerness to appear modern, they removed the one element that made modernization possible, the custodian of the institutional memory they relied upon without understanding. It never occurred to them that replacing a visible role was not the same as replacing the invisible expertise holding every operational artery together. They would learn that lesson soon and painfully. The first sign of trouble didn't arrive like a crisis. It appeared as a minor inconvenience, so small that only someone who understood the system's pulse would have noticed. A supplier called to report duplicated entries in the invoicing portal. A finance analyst mentioned a dashboard taking a few extra seconds to load. A routine payment cycle paused for a fraction longer than expected. These were not dramatic failures, just subtle hesitations, the kind that signal something deeper in complex architectures. Yet instead of prompting investigation, each anomaly was brushed aside with patronizing confidence. The new expert assured everyone that such hiccups were simply the system adapting to his upgrades. He spoke with the arrogance of someone who had never been forced to confront the consequences of his own decisions. He moved through the codebase like a tourist who believed fluency in the language made him a native. Without hesitation, he deleted modules he couldn't explain, dismissing them as outdated clutter. He had no idea those modules were not remnants of the past. They were safety valves, escape routes, and protective layers designed to stop a glitch from becoming a catastrophe. Management listened to him the way children listen to magicians, bewitched by confident gestures and impressed by unfamiliar terminology. They nodded at every explanation he offered, not because they understood it, but because understanding would have required effort. Confidence, to them, was indistinguishable from competence. The danger wasn't the small errors appearing in the system. The danger was the collective pride with which leaders celebrated their ignorance, convinced they had finally freed themselves from the old guard's ways. They believed the system was learning to evolve. In reality, it was beginning to warn them. And like all warnings ignored long enough, it would soon stop whispering and start demanding attention with force they could no longer control. The first real fracture appeared on a Monday morning, wrapped in confusion rather than alarm. A long-standing client called the sales department, frustrated that a simple financial transfer had been rejected without explanation. Within hours, 3 more clients reported identical issues. By noon, entire contracts froze mid-validation, unable to progress beyond the authentication stage. Employees assumed it was a temporary outage, the kind that resolves itself after a system refresh. But refreshing only revealed more unsettling messages. Access denied, permission not found, source identity invalid. Something fundamental was unraveling, and no one understood why. The new leader, still riding the high of his appointment, blamed legacy architecture. He spoke with theatrical impatience, claiming that the system needed time to adjust to his streamlined enhancements. Rather than examine the hidden mechanisms he had disrupted, he layered superficial fixes, temporary patches that restored appearances without addressing the underlying damage. Every patch he deployed was like painting over cracks in a dam, moments before the water found a way through. Departments began to feel the consequences. Contracts stalled, transactions floated in limbo, and international partners demanded assurances that no breach had occurred. Meetings grew longer, explanations vaguer, and confidence thinner. The executives who once joked about how easily I could be replaced now avoided eye contact when technology came up. They smiled too quickly, laughed too loudly, hoping pretense would disguise the truth growing beneath their feet. Silence eventually replaced bravado. It crept into corridors, lingered in boardrooms, and settled into conversations that ended without conclusions. That silence was not empty. It was weighted with the realization that something essential had been removed, not a person but a stabilizing force. They had believed systems were self-sustaining. They discovered, painfully, that certainty is only safe until the moment it is tested. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day when no one expects history to shift. At precisely 10:43 a.m., an automated update, one of the silent guardians I had embedded long ago, initiated itself. Normally, it was a protective measure, a routine check designed to correct unauthorized adjustments before they became systemic threats. But this time, without the safeguards I once maintained, the update behaved very differently. The new regime had removed the invisible fences, assuming they were unnecessary remnants of an older design. They didn't understand that those fences were what separated order from chaos. Within seconds, permissions began to unravel like loose threads from a tapestry. Critical payment circuits, once orchestrated with surgical precision, locked themselves into an endless loop of error messages. Authentication protocols, meant to verify identities, suddenly rejected employees, executives, and international partners alike. Systems that once spoke fluently across continents now communicated in silence. Departments found themselves frozen mid-operation, unable to approve invoices, validate deliveries, or access the most basic operational tools. By the 10th minute, warehouses ceased dispatching goods, carriers waited for authorizations that never arrived, and suppliers demanded explanations no one could give. Executives refreshed screens that no longer acknowledged their authority. The problem wasn't that the system had broken, it was that it no longer recognized its masters. Every structure needs a chain of command. They had severed it without knowing. By the 15th minute, the company's technological empire, years of development, millions of lines of code, and countless transactions, stood like a cathedral with its doors sealed shut. Nothing inside was damaged, yet nothing could move. It was not a failure. It was a paralysis. They once celebrated their speed, proudly calling it innovation. That day, they finally discovered what speed feels like when direction disappears. They hadn't lost features. They had lost control. The boardroom looked nothing like it had the day I left. Gone were the confident grins, the celebratory handshakes, and the smug assurances that progress had been achieved. In their place sat executives hunched over laptops and tablets, refreshing screens that refused to obey. Every loading circle felt like a countdown. Every error message felt like a verdict. They stared not at data, but at consequences, consequences they never imagined would arrive so quickly or so completely. The company they once bragged was too modern to fail now behaved like a machine without a heartbeat. The tension escalated when vendors sent formal notices threatening to suspend contracts unless immediate proof of operational stability was provided. Banks demanded compliance logs and system access audits, documents no one could generate because the system they relied on no longer recognized their authority. International partners froze pending deals, unwilling to tie their futures to a firm incapable of executing simple verifications. The board's pride, once inflated by self-congratulation, deflated with every unanswered request. The replacement, the supposed visionary, sat in silence, fingers trembling over a keyboard he no longer dared touch. Not a single executive spoke his name. Blame evaporates when proof becomes undeniable. They began whispering mine instead, not as a name, but as a solution. For the first time, they understood something they had been too arrogant to consider. You cannot replace experience with ambition, nor expertise with enthusiasm. They thought my departure was a symbolic transition, a step toward modernization. Instead, it was an amputation of institutional memory. Expertise isn't stored in a shared drive or a handbook. It lives in patterns, instincts, and scars earned from failures others never saw. Once removed, it cannot be downloaded or reconstructed. In that moment, surrounded by their own silence, they realized the truth. They hadn't hired a replacement. They had created a void. And voids do not negotiate. They swallow. The call came late in the evening, long after office lights should have dimmed and confidence should have settled. Their voices, once inflated with certainty, now wavered with something unfamiliar: humility. They didn't attempt theatrics or justification. They didn't mention modernization, legacy thinking, or corporate evolution. They spoke plainly, almost whispering, as if afraid someone else might hear them acknowledge the truth. They needed me. Not my title, not my presence, my mind, my experience, my familiarity with a system they had treated like an appliance rather than an organism. I didn't rush. I didn't bargain. I listened as they described halted operations, frozen authorizations, and partners demanding guarantees they couldn't provide. The silence that followed their explanations was more telling than any apology. They weren't inviting me to return. They were pleading for rescue. And yet, I didn't step back into the role they once dismissed so casually. I didn't dust off my old badge or reclaim my former desk. I negotiated terms that ensured I would never again be mistaken for a replaceable cog. My conditions were simple, but revolutionary in their implications. No manager above me, no committee approvals, no endless meetings disguised as problem-solving. I would not be part of their hierarchy. I would be the system's final authority. I made it clear I wasn't returning as an employee, subject to policies drafted by people who couldn't differentiate between a patch and a protocol. I was returning as the architect reclaiming stewardship over a structure that only I understood. They agreed without hesitation. In that instant, the power dynamic shifted, not through confrontation or victory laps, but through the quiet inevitability of competence reclaiming its place. The organization didn't welcome me back. It surrendered, not to my ego, but to the reality it had spent months denying. The CEO summoned me to his office, a place once filled with polished confidence and abstract talk of innovation. Now it felt smaller, as though the walls themselves were embarrassed. He did not offer a handshake or attempt small talk. He went straight to the point, his voice strained. How much will it cost to bring everything back online? It was not a question about price. It was an admission of defeat. For the first time since my departure, he understood that expertise is not an expense. It is insurance. And they had canceled theirs without reading the fine print. I didn't deliver a speech. I didn't revisit old grievances. I simply wrote a number on a sheet of paper and slid it across the table. The CEO stared at it long enough for silence to become another participant in the conversation. His complexion shifted from disbelief to resignation, as if trying to calculate how pride had become the company's most expensive asset. The number wasn't arbitrary. It reflected every minute the system sat dormant, every client on hold, every contract suspended, and every reputation fraying at the edges. The board, once so eager to applaud my replacement, now debated whether they could afford the consequences of refusing my terms. Their dilemma was poetic. They had underestimated the cost of losing someone whose work prevented disasters they never knew existed. While they counted pennies in salaries, I had been saving millions in failures. My value had never been in what I typed, it was in what never broke, because I was there. They finally approved the invoice without negotiation. Their pride, once towering, now sat folded beneath my signature. And in that moment, they learned a truth most leaders only face when it's too late. The most expensive professionals are not the ones you keep, they are the ones you lose. There was no triumphant return, no dramatic confrontation, and certainly no raised voice. I didn't walk into the building like a conqueror. I entered quietly, badge replaced by a universal access token they had been forced to generate for me. The same executives who once avoided my suggestions now stepped aside, as if afraid proximity alone might trigger another collapse. I sat at a workstation they had once deemed outdated and opened the system they believed they understood. It greeted me with familiar prompts, a language they had never bothered to learn. I didn't alter anything. I didn't sabotage code or expose their incompetence. I merely reactivated the protections they had dismantled in their quest to simplify what they never fully grasped. The moment I restored those barriers, the system stabilized. Authentications resumed. Payments completed. Contracts unlocked. Warehouses began to move again. Screens that had mocked executives with error messages flickered back to orderly dashboards. Order didn't return because of shouting or ego. It returned because structure recognized its architect. When I finished, the CEO asked if the nightmare was truly over. I told him the truth. The system would run smoothly, as long as I authorized it. What they saw as arrogance was simply reality. Software doesn't bend to titles, ambitions, or resumes. It bends to comprehension. They had mistaken silence for weakness and consistency for routine. They now understood that technology does not replace the human who built it. It reflects them. My revenge required no anger. It required architecture. They had removed my name from the organization chart, believing it erased my importance. But charts record presence, not impact. The infrastructure did not punish them. It merely revealed the illusion they lived in. 15 minutes had undone their pride. Reactivations sealed their fate.